Hey, it's Michael. Welcome to week 8. So week 7 was a big deal for me and maybe for all of you, as we've been pretty focused on things that are a much more behind the scenes. There's a lot of thinking that happened the week prior that had to do with site mapping. And now that we get to see things, one of my hopes was that you are using your HTML ideas. And when I say ideas, I'm really more talking about prominence. What's a header? Like, what do you need to see? What's important? And what isn't so important? Also, what could be pushed off to, say, another tag like details? And all these become hopefully meaningful now because you don't have to show everything. In fact, I will say I might change the overall assignment, which is to I talk about using three of your records. There's no particular reason I say three other than I just don't want you to go through the tedium of marking up dozens and dozens of records. But the tedium can be helpful when you start to see one thing that we're missing a little bit from this week, and many did it, which is fine, which is, let's say you had more than three things on a page. What needs to stand out in order to have somebody be able to see some other thing than the title, right? Like, let's say, for example, it's a um, well, in any other field, right? Any other useful field, such as maybe if it's a movie, the rating of the movie or the year it came out or something like that. So if you wanted to look and say, hey, here's 6 movies, I want to see the most recent one, you could fumble around and hope for a filter on year released, whatever, or you could just look at the year released if you can find it. And that's one thing in terms of the design aspect. We're not going to get it too heavily into design, but are you emphasizing and showing the things that are the most important to discern one record from another? So I think if I'd change things, I'd say, it doesn't, you can put three of the details, the actual data, and then just have more with more filler details. My point is, I don't want you to go through a lot of work when it doesn't help you see a bigger picture. But right now, focusing on three doesn't mean you have to only have three records. You'll see in your final that, of course, they managed to cram lots and lots of data in many very small places. I am also very thankful we are not doing mobile because that makes it even harder to show more than one thing in an interface. It also makes it harder to compare. So again, my regrets aside, great work. Everybody also, hopefully, as they see other people's work, I see a lot of good back and forth. The reason why you're all doing individual experiences here isn't because you're all doing different things. You all are very much doing the same thing, and there's plenty of conventions. Many of you have taken on, for example, I think of this sidebar with a lot of things in it as a convention that I see often in older style sites or even very complicated sites like an eBay or a Craigslist, where it's just too hard to, there's just too much data, and you really do want to filter out some aspect. That it does not have to be true of your exploration. In fact, most of this is just for you to be able to use these techniques to analyze another site. Hard pause. I'm more than, by the way, another sidebar. I'm more than happy to have a sync session if you'd like. I hope this still works because I feel as though as you engage in the topic for the week, you'll see by doing things that we might not see if I prep you beforehand. Even I didn't really see that by asking for 3 records or having you mark up 3 records that you might feel that 3 records had to fit on this screen, which is definitely not true. Um, I also ask here about what is clickable, which is a big hint for next week, which I'll get to in a moment. Other than that, I know a lot of people, speaking of marking up with data, that's what this was, where it does the work for you, which is fun if you do want to do this later, marking up with a data integration mode here is super fun because you get to see instantly, and then you might be able to see when things don't fit. And that is really another feel for the information architecture, which is prominence. You're just trying to figure out, do things fit? If you were to design a building, same thing. does your living room fit an average couch and maybe two things or whatever fitting is a big word for this week and last week too, is if you have hundreds of terms, it's going to be very difficult to fit them on a screen. So you have to come up with ways to make smaller and smaller groups, but still allow for the richness that taxonomies allow you, which is that you can have hundreds of terms. That's definitely reasonable. Um, so great work. Hopefully, I know some people might have not gotten feedback this week. So if you do want it, just ask me. I'm more than happy to give feedback. Also, as we mentioned, feedback I give to others is really relevant to you too. The problems are very similar, and hopefully that's a good thing because yeah, we don't want to necessarily all go off in our own worlds because we're really dealing with the same goal, which is how do you get something on the screen that helps someone understand the context of what they're looking at and able to find something if they don't see what they're looking for. All right, so off to week 8 and finishing up this particular assignment and working next week, we're going to get into metadata. I know I always feel like this is a big relief that metadata solves a lot of problems, but it in itself is its own problem. And then we're going to get into this idea of like, well, how do you use metadata to actually do other cool stuff? So these two are very theoretical because next week we will just pick a service and start to analyze like how did that service handle their information architecture. But we're going to finish with what I'm calling storyboarding, or we can call it flows. There's some ideas here around flows. One of my favorites is this UI flow shorthand that comes to just seeing how many choices someone can make. So imagine in many of your designs, I could see, you would have theoretically, if you had a bunch of checkboxes and a bunch of nav items, you could have 20, 30 different choices on a screen. Well, this mapping is like, well, if I clicked one of those, what's going to happen? That's really what this shorthand is meant to do. So you could, again, you could write this on a piece of paper, try to minimize how many choices. Now you could just say, well, it doesn't matter which one they pick, the same thing occurs. That's reasonable, right? Like the design doesn't change that much, but you want to be aware of when things do change. Many of you had, for example, a 3-tier navigation system. Well, for each of those tiers, you're going to want to start with the page where you've chosen nothing, right? You've come to the main page, whatever that may be. Each choice needs to be illustrated, right? So you'd have 3 choices to get here. What happens and what do you show in between? Uh, Something to think about. Oops. And I don't think there's actually any movies to support this because we're kind of more into a design. Every design aspect could be a little bit different, which is fine. Here's an area to share. You could just link to your Figma. I think might be easiest because the first will be a sitemap which you might revise, right? I mean, the sitemap wasn't meant to be something that was really hard to do. It was there to say like how many things are going to be on the page. And then your first wireframe is probably the middle of a flow. And a typical flow for me is well, I will, all of this is stated in the rubric, right? But a typical flow is a happy path. Like, hey, I'm going to say, that you would select this on top because it engages you in a way of seeing this data that may be unique, and then lets you filter through to see a list that is a little more specific. That might be what you did last week, and then you'd see either a detail, which is another part, like where do you put details and how do you get back and forward. And so the real story of this storyboard is what we talked about the very first week, which is getting lost and signage. Do people understand what these things do and how they work so that they can manipulate the information on the screen? And the reason you're doing this is once again to use this to analyze another site, along with all the other things. You'll analyze their HTML, their structure, the data itself is a big, like half of the assignment as well. You're going to try to analyze, and you will be able to understand the data that they use, but we'll talk about more of that next week. And you'll also learn, we'll just get into why is metadata so helpful because of that sort order problem that I mentioned to many of you. Is like it's really hard to know what a sort order is. What should I show first? And yet that is Google's entire business model is their sort order, right? That's how they make their money, is to figure out what to put on the screen first. So I said it maybe in the first, the whole point of this is making lists of things, figuring out what goes in what order. You've also made horizontal lists like navigation, but they're all still lists. Everything is really lots of lists, and how do those lists help you orient yourself and give context to the data that you're looking at. So everything's pretty blank this week, waiting for you to fill it up with great ideas. And hopefully, again, if you would like a sync session or anything like that, just let me know. But hopefully, it's just still about working toward understanding the flow. Oh, one last thing is there is a feel or a way in Figma to link a thing to another thing using their prototype tool. So you can just draw a line between one frame and another frame. You don't have to do this, but it is fun to see you actually click on something and it goes someplace else. If you want to try that, give it a try. If you have questions about that, let me know. It's just a way of actually seeing how things change, which was also a big part of that question about clickability. Like, what if, how clicking on something, it just gives you a very narrow focus as a person. You're looking at that thing, you're not looking at the entire screen. So as the screen changes, you want to make sure that you're orienting people. Again, trying not to overcomplicate this too much, but this will wrap things up. And the deliverable is just a link to your Figma. Let me know if you have any questions, and looking forward to the final.